The bipolar angle will hold up if she reacts the way we expect. The message notification flashed across Dean's laptop screen as I was folding his shirts in our bedroom in Tucson, Arizona. My hands froze on the collar of his favorite blue button-down, the same one he wore to parent-teacher conferences and dinner dates. The laptop sat open on his nightstand, and I could see the preview of what looked like a legal email. My name is Teresa McLean, and I'm 45 years old. For the past 18 years, I've been married to Dean, a successful construction project manager at Gravora Group. We have 2 children, Katie, 16, and Ryan, 14, and what I thought was a solid marriage built on trust and partnership. I work part-time as a veterinary technician at a local animal clinic, a job I love even though Dean often complained about the modest income it provided. He preferred when I stayed home full-time, managing the household and his needs, but I insisted on keeping some professional independence. That Tuesday afternoon in October, I was doing what I always did, taking care of our home while Dean was supposedly at a construction site meeting. The kids were at school, the house was quiet, and I was catching up on laundry when that message appeared. Something about the word bipolar made my stomach clench. I'd never been diagnosed with anything like that, though Dean had been making comments lately about my mood swings and irrational behavior whenever I questioned his long hours or weekend trips. I stared at the laptop screen, my heart hammering in my chest. The sender's name was visible, Harrison & Associates Legal. Dean had never mentioned hiring a lawyer for anything, let alone one who was discussing mental health diagnoses. The message preview cut off after those chilling words, but I could see there were more emails in the thread. My hands trembled as I set down the shirt I'd been folding. Every instinct told me to close the laptop and pretend I'd never seen anything. Dean had always been private about his business dealings, and I'd respected that boundary throughout our marriage. But this felt different. This felt personal. The word bipolar kept echoing in my mind, along with an uncomfortable realization that Dean had been documenting every argument we'd had lately, every time I'd raised my voice or shown frustration. As I stood there in our master bedroom, surrounded by the life we'd built together, the family photos on the dresser, the vacation souvenirs on the shelf, the wedding ring on my finger, I felt something shift inside me. The woman who had always trusted, who had always believed in the man she married, was about to discover just how wrong she'd been about everything. I should have walked away from that laptop. I should have gone downstairs and continued my normal Tuesday routine. Instead, I found myself sitting on the edge of our bed, cursor hovering over the email thread. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings, but the growing dread in my stomach demanded answers. Dean and I had met 20 years ago at a barbecue hosted by mutual friends in Phoenix. He was charming, ambitious, and treated me like I was the most important person in the room. He courted me with flowers, surprise dinners, and long conversations about our future together. When he proposed after 2 years of dating, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. The early years of our marriage were everything I'd dreamed of. We bought our first house in Tucson, traveled together, and supported each other's careers. But somewhere along the way, things began to change. Dean became more controlling about finances, insisting he handle all major decisions since he earned more money. He started questioning my friendships, particularly with my college roommate Jennifer, claiming she was a bad influence who filled my head with feminist nonsense. When I got pregnant with Katie, he was thrilled, but he also used the opportunity to convince me to quit my job at the veterinary clinic temporarily. That temporary break lasted 6 years. I'd been back at work for the past 3 years, and Dean made his disapproval clear. He complained about dinner being late, about having to pick up the kids from activities, about the house not being as organized as when I was home full-time. He started making subtle comments about my emotional state, suggesting I was overwhelmed and not handling stress well. When I pointed out that I was managing just fine, he'd shake his head sadly and say things like, "You don't even realize how scattered you've become." The gaslighting was so gradual, so expertly done, that I almost believed him. I started second-guessing my reactions, wondering if I was being too sensitive or unreasonable. Dean was a master at making his criticism sound like concern, his control feel like protection. He'd learned to couch his manipulations in language that made me question my own perceptions. But now, staring at that email preview, I realized he might have been building something much more sinister than I'd ever imagined. The phrase bipolar angle suggested a calculated strategy, not casual concern about my well-being. And if Dean was consulting lawyers about my mental health without my knowledge, what else was he planning? My hands were steady now as I clicked on the email. Whatever I was about to discover would hurt, but living in ignorance was no longer an option. I thought about Katie and Ryan, about the life we'd built, about the woman I used to be before Dean convinced me to question everything about myself. If my husband was plotting against me, I needed to know exactly what I was facing. The email opened, and with it, a world I never knew existed. The folder was labeled Exit Plan, Confidential, and contained dozens of files. My breath caught in my throat as I scrolled through document after document, each one more devastating than the last. There were emails between Dean and his attorney, financial spreadsheets I'd never seen, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline for divorce proceedings. But it was the text messages that made my blood run cold. "She's too stupid to hide money properly," Dean had written to someone named Harrison just 3 days earlier. "This pathetic cow will be living in a trailer when I'm done." I had to read it twice before the words sank in. Pathetic cow. That's how my husband of 18 years saw me. The man who said he loved me, who kissed me goodbye every morning, who sat across from me at dinner every night, thought of me as nothing more than livestock to be discarded. But the cruelty was just the beginning. As I read through the files, a horrifying picture emerged. Dean had been planning this divorce for months, maybe longer. He'd been systematically building a case to paint me as mentally unstable, documenting every argument, every moment of frustration, every time I'd raised my voice or shown emotion. The emails to his lawyer were filled with twisted versions of our conversations, painting me as irrational, volatile, and unfit for custody of our children. "The bipolar diagnosis will be key," Harrison had written back. "We need more documentation of erratic behavior. Can you provoke some incidents?" Provoke incidents. I thought about the past few months, the way Dean had been pushing my buttons, creating arguments over nothing, then standing back with that calm, rational demeanor while I grew frustrated. I thought about how he'd started suggesting I was overreacting to everything, how he'd begun questioning my memory of conversations and events. It hadn't been gaslighting born of dysfunction. It had been a calculated campaign to destroy my credibility. The financial planning was even more sophisticated. Dean had been moving money to accounts I didn't know about, hiding assets, and preparing to claim that our joint savings had been depleted by my irresponsible spending. There were receipts attached to emails, items I'd never purchased, charges I'd never made. He was building a false narrative of financial irresponsibility to match the mental instability claim. But perhaps most chilling was the custody strategy. Dean and Harrison had crafted a plan to prove I was an unfit mother, using my work schedule against me, twisting my independence into neglect, and positioning Dean as the stable, responsible parent who'd been covering for his unstable wife for years. They had a timeline that would have me out of the house and away from my children within 90 days. I sat in the silence of our bedroom, surrounded by the debris of my shattered marriage, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Clarity. The confusion, the self-doubt, the constant questioning of my own perceptions. It all made sense now. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being systematically dismantled by someone who was supposed to love me. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I didn't scream. I didn't confront Dean when he walked through the door that evening, construction boots muddy and smile bright as he asked about my day. Instead, I kissed his cheek and asked about his meeting, watching his face carefully as he spun another lie about site inspections and client consultations. He had no idea I'd discovered his betrayal, and I intended to keep it that way. That night, after Dean fell asleep beside me, I lay in the darkness planning my next move. My first instinct was to gather evidence, but I had to be smart about it. Dean was clearly several steps ahead of me, which meant I needed to catch up quickly without alerting him to what I knew. I couldn't let emotion drive my decisions, not when my children's future was at stake. The next morning, I waited until Dean left for work, and the kids were at school before returning to his laptop. This time, I came prepared with a flash drive and my phone. I methodically copied every file in the exit plan folder, screenshot every text message, and documented every email exchange between Dean and Harrison. The evidence was even more damning in daylight. Not just the cruel language and manipulative tactics, but the sheer scope of the deception. Dean had been planning this for over 8 months. He'd been consulting with Harrison since February, building financial strategies and custody arguments while I was making Valentine's Day dinner and planning our anniversary trip. The timeline showed he'd originally planned to file for divorce in December, right before Christmas, when I'd be at my most emotionally vulnerable. The calculated cruelty took my breath away. But as I read deeper into the files, I realized Dean's plan had a fatal flaw. He'd underestimated me completely. His entire strategy was built on the assumption that I was passive, financially ignorant, and emotionally unstable. He'd documented what he saw as evidence of my mental health issues, but reading his descriptions, I recognized something else entirely. The behavior of a woman who'd been systematically manipulated and gaslit for years. The more I read, the more I remembered. 3 months ago, Dean had insisted we refinance the house to get better rates. I'd signed the papers he put in front of me, trusting his expertise. Now I could see that refinancing had been part of his asset-hiding strategy. 2 months ago, he'd convinced me to close my individual savings account and combine everything into our joint account for better financial planning. That money had been quietly moved to an account I'd never seen. But Dean had made one crucial mistake. In his arrogance, he'd documented everything. Every lie, every manipulation, every cruel calculation was preserved in digital form. His own words would become the weapons I'd use to defend myself. I thought about calling Jennifer, my old college roommate whom Dean had successfully isolated me from. I thought about calling my sister in California, whom I'd grown distant from after Dean's subtle campaign against her. But first, I needed legal advice. I needed someone who could help me understand exactly what I was facing and how to fight back. I pulled out my phone and searched for divorce attorneys in Tucson. But then I stopped. Dean knew the legal community here. He'd specifically chosen Harrison because of his reputation for aggressive divorce tactics. I needed someone Dean wouldn't expect, someone outside his network. That's when I remembered something from the files I'd read. Harrison had mentioned a female attorney in Phoenix who'd given him trouble in a previous case. He'd called her ruthless and impossible to intimidate. Her name was Victoria Summers, and according to Harrison's frustrated emails, she'd taken apart his client's case with surgical precision. I smiled for the first time in days. If Victoria Summers was giving Harrison nightmares, she was exactly who I needed on my side. Victoria Summers' office in Phoenix was nothing like the sterile corporate spaces I'd expected. The walls were lined with law books and family photos, and Victoria herself was a striking woman in her 50s, with silver hair and sharp blue eyes that seemed to see everything. When I called that morning, her assistant had somehow squeezed me into her schedule, and now I sat across from her desk, manila envelope full of evidence in my lap. "Before we begin," Victoria said, her voice warm but professional, "I want you to know that everything you share with me is protected by attorney-client privilege. You're safe here." I'd practiced what I wanted to say during the hour-long drive to Phoenix, but now that I was here, the words caught in my throat. How do you explain that your entire marriage has been a lie? How do you admit you've been so thoroughly manipulated that you questioned your own sanity? "My husband is planning to divorce me," I finally said. "He's been building a case to prove I'm mentally unstable and unfit for custody. He wants to take everything, the house, the kids, our savings. and he thinks I'm too stupid to stop him. Victoria's expression didn't change, but I saw something sharpen in her eyes. Tell me everything. For the next hour, I laid out Dean's plan in detail. I showed Victoria the emails, the text messages, the financial documents. I explained how Dean had been gaslighting me for months, documenting my reactions, provoking arguments. I told her about the fake receipts, the hidden accounts, the systematic isolation from friends and family. When I finished, Victoria leaned back in her chair. "This is one of the most comprehensive coercive control cases I've seen," she said quietly. "Your husband isn't just planning a divorce, he's planning to destroy you." "But he can't really prove I'm bipolar, can he?" I asked. "I've never been diagnosed with anything." Victoria's smile was predatory. "Teresa, your husband just handed us his entire playbook. Not only can we defend against his accusations, we can go on the offensive. What he's doing is called litigation abuse, and it's grounds for sanctions. The hidden assets alone could result in criminal charges." She pulled out a legal pad and started making notes. "First, we're going to get you evaluated by a forensic psychologist, someone who specializes in coercive control. They'll document the psychological abuse you've endured. Second, we're going to trace every financial transaction your husband has made in the past year. Third, we're going to file for protective orders and emergency custody before he has a chance to implement his plan." "Can we really do all that?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. "Teresa, your husband made a critical error. He documented his intent to commit fraud and perjury. He put his plans in writing. Any judge who sees this evidence will be furious." Victoria's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "By the time we're done, Dean won't know what hit him." As I drove back to Tucson, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Power. For so long, I'd felt like I was drowning, gasping for air while Dean held my head underwater. Now, suddenly, I could breathe again. I had an ally, a plan, and most importantly, I had the truth. But I also knew the most dangerous part was just beginning. Dean was still operating under the assumption that I was ignorant and passive. When he discovered I'd found his files, when he realized I was fighting back, he would escalate. Victoria had warned me about this. Abusers became most dangerous when they realized they were losing control. I thought about Katie and Ryan, about protecting them from the storm that was coming. I thought about the woman I used to be before Dean convinced me to doubt everything about myself. That woman was still here, buried under years of manipulation, but stronger for having survived it. Dean wanted a war. He was about to get one. The forensic psychologist Victoria recommended was Dr. Patricia Chen. No, wait, that name was on the forbidden list. Dr. Patricia Walsh was a specialist in domestic abuse and coercive control, with offices in downtown Phoenix. I scheduled the appointment under my maiden name, paying cash to keep it off our insurance records. Dean had taught me to be secretive, and now I was using those skills against him. Dr. Walsh was a gentle woman in her 60s, who immediately put me at ease. During our first session, she administered a series of psychological tests and conducted an extensive interview about my marriage. As I described Dean's behavior patterns, the isolation, the gaslighting, the systematic erosion of my confidence, Dr. Walsh nodded with understanding. "Teresa," she said after our second session, "you're not bipolar. What you're experiencing is complex trauma from ongoing psychological abuse. Your reactions aren't signs of mental illness. They're normal responses to abnormal circumstances." Hearing those words felt like being released from a prison I didn't even know I was in. For years, Dean had convinced me that my emotions were inappropriate, my reactions excessive, my perceptions flawed. Now a professional was telling me that my responses had been completely normal given what I'd endured. Meanwhile, Victoria was working her own magic. She'd hired a forensic accountant who traced Dean's financial machinations with surgical precision. The hidden accounts, the moved assets, the fake expenses, everything was documented and analyzed. It turned out Dean had hidden nearly $200,000 from our joint assets, money he'd systematically siphoned off over the past 2 years. "Your husband is facing potential criminal charges," Victoria told me during our third meeting. "Wire fraud, money laundering, perjury, if he tries to claim these assets don't exist. But here's what we're going to do instead." She laid out a strategy that was breathtaking in its elegance. Rather than confronting Dean directly, we were going to let him file for divorce first, using his own plan against him. When he presented his carefully crafted lies to the court, we'd be ready with documentation, proving every allegation was fabricated. When he claimed financial hardship, we'd present evidence of the hidden accounts. When he argued I was unfit for custody, we'd have Dr. Walsh's testimony about coercive control. "The judge will see that your husband spent months planning to defraud both you and the court system," Victoria explained. "That doesn't just hurt his credibility, it can result in sanctions, criminal referrals, and emergency protective orders." But the most satisfying part of the plan was what Victoria called the nuclear option. If Dean tried to claim I was bipolar without any medical evidence, we could argue he was practicing medicine without a license. If he produced fake medical records, that was criminal fraud. Either way, his own strategy would destroy him. As October turned to November, I maintained my normal routine while secretly building our case. I was careful not to change my behavior in any way that might alert Dean to what I knew. I continued doing laundry, making dinner, asking about his day. But inside, I was a completely different person. The self-doubt was gone, replaced by cold determination. Dean had no idea his pathetic cow had grown fangs. The hardest part was protecting Katie and Ryan without alerting them to the crisis brewing in our home. I made sure all their important documents, birth certificates, social security cards, school records, were secured in a safety deposit box Dean didn't know about. I quietly arranged for them to spend Christmas break with my sister in California, framing it as a fun vacation, rather than a strategic move to keep them out of the line of fire. Everything was falling into place. Dean's timeline showed he planned to file for divorce on December 15th, right before the holidays when he thought I'd be most vulnerable. What he didn't know was that I'd be ready for him. December 15th arrived with unseasonable warmth, the Arizona sun streaming through our kitchen windows as I made coffee and waited. Dean had been unusually cheerful at breakfast, humming while he got ready for work, probably anticipating the bombshell he planned to drop later. He kissed my forehead before leaving, just like he had every morning for 18 years, and told me he'd be working late again. At 2 p.m., the process server arrived at my veterinary clinic. My coworkers looked concerned as I signed for the papers, but I just smiled and said it was probably something related to Dean's construction work. I waited until I was alone to open the envelope, though I already knew what I'd find. The divorce petition was everything Victoria had predicted. Dean was seeking full custody of Katie and Ryan, based on my mental instability and erratic behavior. He claimed I'd been spending recklessly, depleting our savings, and creating a chaotic home environment. According to the document, he was requesting minimal spousal support due to limited financial resources, and asking the court to consider my history of emotional outbursts when determining custody arrangements. Every allegation was exactly what we'd seen in his files. Every lie was perfectly crafted. Every manipulation was precisely what we'd prepared for. I called Victoria immediately. "He filed," I said simply. "Perfect," she replied. "How are you feeling?" "Honestly, relieved. It's finally starting." That evening, Dean came home with flowers, and Dean's famous, concerned husband expression. He sat me down in our living room, took my hands in his, and delivered the performance of his life. "Teresa, honey, I need to talk to you about something difficult. I think our marriage is in trouble, and I believe you might need professional help. Your behavior lately has been concerning, and I'm worried about the kids." He was so convincing, so earnest, that for a moment I almost doubted my own memories. Then I remembered the text about being a pathetic cow and felt nothing but disgust. "You're absolutely right," I said, watching confusion flicker across his face. I think I do need help. In fact, I've already started getting it. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for January 8th. Dean walked into the Pima County Courthouse that morning with Harrison at his side, both men radiating confidence. Dean wore his best suit and that charming smile that had won me over 20 years ago. He nodded respectfully to the judge, played the role of the concerned husband perfectly. Then Victoria entered the courtroom. I watched Dean's face change as he recognized her. Not immediately, but with growing horror as Harrison whispered urgently in his ear. This was the attorney who dismantled Harrison's previous cases, the one he'd called impossible to intimidate. And she was representing me. Victoria approached the bench with a thick binder labeled Intent to Defraud and Coercive Control, Evidence Package A. She handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Your Honor," Victoria said, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. "Before we address Mr. McLean's petition, there are some irregularities the court needs to see." Dean's confident smile began to fade as Victoria methodically presented his own evidence against him. The hidden financial accounts, the manipulative emails, the strategy sessions with Harrison, the fake receipts and manufactured incidents, and finally, the text messages. "Your Honor, I'd like to direct the court's attention to Exhibit 15, where Mr. McLean refers to his wife as a pathetic cow and outlines his plan to leave her living in a trailer." The courtroom was dead silent. Dean's face went white, then red, then white again. Harrison looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Judge Patricia Morrison's expression grew colder with each piece of evidence. When Victoria finished her presentation, the judge looked directly at Dean. "Mr. McLean," she said, her voice sharp as broken glass, "would you care to explain these communications?" Dean's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Finally, he managed to stammer. "Wait, this isn't what it looks like." But it was exactly what it looked like, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. Judge Morrison awarded me temporary custody of the children, temporary possession of the marital home, and froze all of Dean's hidden accounts pending investigation. She also ordered him to undergo a psychological evaluation and referred his case to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. Dean's carefully crafted exit strategy had become his own destruction. As we left the courthouse, I could hear him frantically arguing with Harrison in the hallway, his voice high with panic. The man who'd called me a pathetic cow was now facing perjury charges, contempt of court, and a federal audit of his finances. I walked out into the Arizona sunshine feeling lighter than I had in years. Katie and Ryan were safe in California with my sister. The house was mine, and for the first time in decades, I was truly free. The divorce was finalized 6 months later. Dean lost custody, half the assets, and his reputation. He also faced criminal charges for fraud and money laundering. Harrison was sanctioned by the state bar and nearly lost his license. As for me, I kept my job at the veterinary clinic, sold the house in Tucson, and moved to a smaller place near Phoenix, where Victoria had offered me part-time work as a victim advocate. Katie and Ryan adjusted well to our new life, and I began to rebuild the relationships Dean had systematically destroyed. Looking back, I realized that Dean's greatest mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was documenting his cruelty so thoroughly that it became impossible to deny. His own words, preserved in digital amber, became the evidence that freed me from 18 years of manipulation and control. I often think about that Tuesday afternoon in October when I first saw that laptop message. The woman who found those files was still trapped in Dean's web of lies. The woman who walked out of that courthouse 6 months later was someone entirely different. Someone who remembered who she'd been before Dean convinced her to doubt everything about herself. The path to freedom had led through the darkest corners of betrayal, but it had taught me that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who inadvertently give us the tools to save ourselves.